And there were attempts by rapprochement by Zelensky when he's elected a few years ago. He comes in as someone who ran on promises of reconciling, of ending the war in eastern Ukraine, of rebuilding relationships with Russia. And once he comes into office, and I think this comes from a lot of American and British pressure through these various right-wing groups that the Americans and British are allied with or have good connections with, he quickly sees that that's not a possibility, that the powers that are behind the Ukrainian government, military, paramilitary, economic, they are not going to allow such a reconciliation, that they prosper from this friction. And you get to the point even in the months before the Russian invasion where the Russians are providing draft an opportunity to negotiate or draft settlements. Here's our proposal for what we can do to because remember again that in 2021 the violence in Ukraine renews and things are getting bad there. So what you have the Russians doing in the late fall, early winter of 2021 is trying to offer some type of pathway. Whether or not it was going to ever be acceptable, whether or not it was complete garbage is not the point.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't go into a negotiation offering, to give up things. You always go in saying, this is what we want. And then that's the purpose of negotiation is, both sides go in. It's a question of, I just heard this said the other day with negotiations. It's not about winning. It's about losing as little as possible. And that's how I think mature adults understand negotiations. Unfortunately, I don't think we have that in London, Washington, Kyiv at this point. So, we had all these things tumult, right? And all these things combine. It's one step after another that leads us to, February 24th of last year, and the Russians launch an invasion, which, has just been absolutely awful. And everything I've said up until now that clearly saying that there was provocations by the West, by the Americans that instigated things, staged coups. None of that, of course, allows for an invasion by one nation of another. So
I was going to ask that. I was going to say all the provocations, the expansion of NATO, and then even after 2014, obviously Russia takes Crimea. Like, this is a red flag. They're like, well, we're going to train them. We're going to arm them at like thousands. I mean, you can hear British officials, US, Canadian, kind of like almost bragging about how many they've trained. They have it on their websites. I think it was mainly Canada, the US, and the UK, probably some other NATO forces under the banner of NATO. Do you think that isn't enough to justify? Because obviously there's a lot of people on the anti-war side who are so obviously against NATO, the US, and everything they do, that they're sort of maybe giving them Russia too much of a free pass of justifying the invasion. I don't think they justify it as in they're okay with it, but
yeah.
You know what I mean.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I think you all in Britain are. I don't know if you're as bad as we are here in the U.S., but everything has been simplified down into a binary construct. It's always A versus B. It's always in red versus blue, red for Republicans, blue versus Democrat. And there's no ability to have a conversation larger than that. There's no ability to bring in context or nuance or to have, any type of anything other than this very simple A versus B. And that, of course, fits well into like a Manichaean structure, right, of good versus evil. And that's what you have with the Russian war. If you just start the clock, kind of as we were talking about when we started this conversation, you just start the clock on this thing on February of last year. Of course, the Russians are on the wrong side. Of course, right? I mean, absolutely. But if you start to bring in other aspects of it, it all. This is why it's so important. What's your start date for history? And this is one of the things that I think, case in point, in my example, in my experiences, with the war in Afghanistan. The number of fellow Americans that I worked with, even on the anti-war side, who were just so rigid in their when they spoke about Afghanistan, worked on it, thought about it, that this is something that is a post 9/11 event, right? That the previous decades of Civil War, occupation, that somehow doesn't compute, doesn't matter, isn't worth commenting on, and doesn't need to be taken into your estimation of the current situation. I mean, which is just insane. I don't think any of us in our lives would ever do that. Be like, nothing for me before the age of 37 matters. Nothing happened that, I mean, like, right. I mean, like, no, we don't live like that. And we don't, also in our history, we talk about our history, here in the United States. I live in the South, and there are plenty of people who would have coronary if you were to say that the American Civil War has no presence on modern American society. People would have a heart attack if you were to suggest that, because it's true. It totally does. And that war was, a war ended in 1865, right? So 160 years ago or whatever. And it's, I mean, like, but when we put our, with these other events outside our borders, or, certainly I think for political purposes, and in the media, the way the media is structured, that they want a simpler, tighter, easier story to tell, and they love the good versus evil. They love the A versus B. They love the red versus blue, right? Which team are you on? Which side are you on? I mean, somehow, it's very inane, because you look at the discussions of this war in the United States, and it is like this completely devoid of context, nuance, history, any type of I don't want to say sophistication to the argumentation or the discussion, but any type of detail to it, and anything that's complex, and anything that might upend an existing narrative. And that's why Russia, anything that might upend an existing narrative is just dismissed. It's ignored, it's problematic, and this is why Russia is such a great adversary for the United States, because you've had a history, just like you all did, and you had a much longer history in Britain with Russia, the bear, as an adversary. I mean, this is why you all invade Afghanistan in the 19th century, because you're claiming that the Russians are going to invade India through Afghanistan. The Russians never planned to do that, but that was it, right? I mean, so you launched these wars and invasions and occupations of Afghanistan in the 19th century because of Russia, right? I mean, and so then, of course, when the Bolsheviks take power, now in America, that really gets us very concerned, particularly Wall Street, because my God, if the workers here, due to what they did to the Tsar and his people in Russia, we're all in a lot of trouble, well-deserved trouble. But, we're in a lot of trouble. So, I mean, you've had this adversary, this buildup, this narrative, this conditioning of American, British understanding of who Russia is and how they are always the adversary. So, to try and undo that, to try and unwrap that, to try and get on, say, CNN or BBC, right, and talk about this for 2.5 minutes, how do you do it? And they don't want that either. One, it's complicated, but also two, the Western media is so tied to the NATO U.S. narrative of this war for a lot of different reasons. And just the same way too, I try and look at Russian media as much as possible, and it's complete garbage, complete nonsense. Best thing you can do is you can find two stories that sort of overlap from the West and from Russia. You put them together, you do kind of a Venn diagram, and you try and figure out where the overlapping truths are. It's complete nonsense. I mean, just so that's why I'd say people who speak about these wars with this war with any degree of certainty, as if they know where it's going, and particularly if they've been commentating of the wars of the last 20 years and have been dead wrong about them, like most media commentators have been, I'd say to folks to be very suspect of what you're hearing.
Yeah, people definitely do get stuck in that. We're the good side, they're the bad side because they invaded. You can say, oh, I disagree with us, provoking them, expanding NATO, but I also disagree with Russia invading. It can be, you can live in both worlds, but people obviously find it hard to do that. I mean, it's like even in the 80s, we go from supporting Saddam Hussein against Iran to a couple of years later, George H.W. Bush, who was part of that Reagan administration, saying he's Hitler. And then I don't understand how you can go from that to that, but people obviously seem to forget. But I mean,
we do it all the time. We did it with the United States did it with Panama when I was a senior in high school. So when I was 17 years old, 18 years old, we had U.S. had to send forces into Panama to get rid of Manuel Noriega.
George H.W. Bush.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, George H.W. Bush, who had worked with Noriega when he was the director of the CIA in the 70s, right? Because Noriega was a CIA asset. And, and I mean, and then we turned, as soon as it became uncomfortable and convenient, we turned on him. We just had that happen this year. And I think you all did as well recently in Britain in terms of any types of assistance that our Congress could have done for Afghan refugees. They just completely threw their hands up in the air and abandoned it. And I think your parliament's about the same with that as well, if I'm familiar with it. But so these folks who fought and bled with us for the better part of 20 years, and then they probably had some history going back before that through the Civil War and the war against the Russians, maybe, or at least their families did in terms of being connected to us somehow, the Americans and the British, and then of course what occurs in Afghanistan, the U.S. retreat from there, and then these people who were promised, and then who put their lives on the line for us, and I think you can appreciate what they did without taking a side in that conflict or weighing. But that's another war. It's a good war to analyze in the sense that there were no good sides. And I think that's what you come back to with the Ukraine war, which is so hard for people, again, this good versus evil structure, is that there are no good sides here. And so the discussions keep being about either the past, right? People trying to say this is why Russia's evil. This is why the U.S. and Britain and NATO are no good imperialist, conquestors. I mean, and both can be true.
Yeah.
But the lack of discussion we have is about, okay, what do we do going forward? And oftentimes it gets dominated then by talks of, is Germany going to give Ukraine Leopard tanks or not? Right? I mean, as if the 15 tanks are somehow going to make a difference in the outcome of this war. But that's how the mindset is, the discussion is, and that allows for the media to have a narrative that's strictly controlled. Meanwhile, there's almost no discussion about, okay, how do you end this war? How do you find negotiations? Which is frustrating, I think, for a lot of us, because that's what we want to talk about. How do you end this thing? What can we do going forward? What's possible to end it? And in the U.S., I mean, if you, and I would imagine it's the same in Britain. If you didn't follow independent media sources, if you weren't watching Al Jazeera or TRT or something like that, so watching the Qataris or the Turks of all people, you would have no idea that there have been prisoner swaps, and that the Russians and Ukrainians meet, and that there are attempts at maybe talking and everything else. Because the Western media doesn't want to report that, because that complicates the narrative.